2024 has been nothing short of eventful, a year of promise and setbacks for Africa. Moderate economic recovery offered a glimpse of hope. The African Union had its first year in the G20, while Egypt and Ethiopia participated in BRICS as full members, signifying the growing influence of the continent. But challenges persisted. The Sudan conflict slipped further and further away from the global radar as instability in the Sahel worsened. And the economic crisis in several countries has triggered large-scale protests. So this week on the program, we reflect on 2024 and what a year it was. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And we have a lot to unpack, so let's now bring in our panel of experts. Joining me here in studio, Dr. Adere Kavins, international relations expert. From Abuja, Professor Ken Ife, finance analyst and lead consultant at the ECOWAS Commission. And in Yaoundé via Zoom, David Otto Endele, Director, Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us in this discussion. I want to start by looking back at the year 2024. Dr. Adere, let me start off with you here. So, what were the most significant developments across Africa in 2024, according to you, and how did they shape the continent's trajectory?
Well, a number of things, especially when you talk about the relationship between China and Africa. But beyond that, I mean, this year we saw the successful staging of the FOCAC summit in Beijing that brought together the highest number of African leaders who ever participated in that. Actually, it is the largest attended summit of Africa plus one, in the history of summits. We also saw a number of initiatives, especially those are aimed at promoting economic and trade partnership with China. China, during the FOCAC, announced, for example, that 33 African countries that fall under the least developed category would have their exports into the Chinese market, tariff-free. This is very significant. We also saw continued implementation of signature projects from Beijing, such as the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, as well as the Global Civilizational Initiative. These initiatives are emblematic of the kind of innovative thinking that are coming out of China in terms of its international partnerships with countries, especially those in developing spaces like Africa. But I think at the same time, we saw, for example, the staging of elections, for example, in the US, and what it is likely going to mean for its relationship with Africa. And so these are some of the things that I think stand out in terms of the things that have happened this year.
So, Dr. Adere, there was quite a bit of activity on that multilateral front. 2 African countries became members of the BRICS group, and the African Union had its first year as a member of the G20. Does this say something about Africa's growing importance globally? What happened?
No, basically, the truth is that the future of the world without Africa is a very bleak future. Africa, the only space that has the potential for growth. This is the space that has not been, developed fully. And it's the youngest continent with just a mean age of 19 years. And so if you look at what's going on with all these attempts by especially global powers to effectively mainstream their relations with the continent, it tells you the significance of Africa. It's not that Africa hasn't been important before. It's just that the voices of Africans and the priorities of Africa hasn't been put on the table. And as Africa grows, as Africa's importance grows in the global stage, we see, interest from these developed countries trying to work closely with the continent. And that's why you see there was increased numbers of African countries in the BRICS Plus, as well as the inclusion of, the African Union within the G20 club, joining South Africa in that club. So it gives Africans an opportunity to reimagine what multilateralism can deliver, but also sending a message that Africa is ready for business. Africa is ready for partnerships, investments, and Africa is actually the frontier that is going to help the world, make the transition to green development, because this is the space with the largest number of, commodities, raw materials that are needed for green energy transition, whether you talk about solar or wind or geothermal. The increased importance of Africa is coming out not because of anything except that Africans are speaking out so loudly, but the significance of Africa in the world stage is taking shape in manners that we haven't seen before.
Right. Professor Ife, your take on the most significant developments across the continent?
Africa has performed better than is expected. In fact, you can see growth levels heading to pre-COVID, pandemic COVID level. What World Bank has projected, even by the close of this month, that Africa will be closing at about 3.4% growth, and next year they will go up to 3.8%. Even though that is an average, it masks the wide variability across nations, because 11 out of 20 fastest growing economies in the world are from Africa, ranging from the likes of Niger, posting 11%, and the Senegal, 8.2%, and so on. And in terms of the regions, the continents themselves, Africa is number 2 fastest growing continent after Asia. So all the signs there are positive that Africa is going to continue to make it in terms of growth. We find that the drivers of that growth are the consumption, the private and household consumptions. They are going up. And also, part of the reason why they are going up is because the investment flow is improving. And the likes of the bilateral, plurilateral, and multilateral agreements that between countries are actually posting more resources to Africa. China is a very good example in their FOCAP bilateral, very good in their investments. And many other things are coming in and giving us that growth and that hope.
So, David, we got into 2024 with a conflict ongoing, South Sudan, the DRC, Africa's longest conflict, and the Sahel region. I do want to find out from you about the various peace initiatives that were conducted. How effective were the African Union-led initiatives and the regional blocs like IGAD in addressing the situation in Sudan and the Sahel countries, organizations like the ECOWAS?
Well, I think, Beatrice, the African Union has experienced a lot of challenges. Not that the African Union has not been active or proactive in trying to address these issues, but it has just experienced a lot of challenges, which in some quarters can be described as a weakness. For example, we talk about the conflict that emerged in the Sahel, whereby the African Union had to sit tight and somehow let ECOWAS deal with that. And the repercussions and the ripple effect of that, was, something that almost led to, conventional warfare between ECOWAS, and Niger, at the time. That was, something which eventually led to backdoor diplomacy and peace initiatives, that were conducted. But the effect is that, ECOWAS became divided in the sense that most of those countries in the Sahel, they then had to leave ECOWAS and establish their own alliances. So that's also another area where I believe that the African Union and some of the regional bodies will be looking behind and thinking that what could have been done differently in the current scenario. You talk about the existing conflict that is occurring, as you rightly mentioned, in Sudan, in DRC, in the Horn of Africa. All these conflicts, what has been quite significant, Beatrice, is that there is a lot of external, pushbacks, and interest that, to some extent, has led to external parties and also internal parties taking sides instead of finding a common ground. And this is why some of the peace initiatives that were instituted by countries like United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, the United States, even some African countries like South Sudan that intervene in the Sudan conflict. You talk about IGAD intervening in the conflict in DRC. All these initiatives haven't worked because of the external influence. Look at DRC Congo. There was the countries like Kenya that went for peacekeeping mission, and then what happened was that the DRC Congo decided to expel this peacekeeping mission. So it has been quite a roller coaster of initiatives. But one common disadvantage is that most of these initiatives have not been comprehensive. Each party wants to play God in terms of trying to be the ones to resolve it. And this is why we're still experiencing the conflict in Sudan, because of warring factions supporting one side to the other. So it's quite a critical situation, right, not just in the Sahel, but across the continent, where I believe that the African Union, as you rightly pointed out, they need to stand their ground, and perform the role that the African Union is supposed to perform, especially when it comes to conflicts of the nature that we're experiencing in Sudan, in Somalia, in Nigeria, just cutting across the continent, Beatrice.
So, Professor Ife, I want to come back to you on the economy, because you've painted a good picture, an optimistic picture of Africa's economic growth, particularly on some of the countries. But continent-wide, though, intra-Africa's trade still remains very low. Africa's continental free trade area is gaining momentum. So what's your assessment of its implementation in 2024?
Well, 2024 is a teething period. I know that it's going to gather more momentum next year, in 2025. And all the signs are there. One is there is increased investment that is coming in from plurilateral, bilateral, and multilateral platforms. Let me give you an example. You saw that the IDA in 21st replenishment placed an additional $25 billion. Then we're going to benefit from that. And secondly, it's about 400, and according to Africa Development Bank, 402.2 billion funding financing gap in Africa is there, and then we are looking at closing some of that by raising about $169.4 billion from three activities. One, from the special drawing rights of the IMF, recycling that, and then secondly, looking at how you can implement these multilateral development banks' capital adequacy reforms to free up more capital, because they are sequestered, quite a substantial capital are sequestered. Right. Then, of course, the third one is reforming the credit rating. All of these can cumulatively bring in additional 169 billion release for infrastructure investment. Obviously, Africa continental free trade will gather momentum because consumption is increasing. Consumption is increasing, both private consumption and domestic investment, as well as foreign direct investment coming in to promote growth. And so that growth is coming in trade. Apart from trade, we have investment and trade, and then also regional integration activity.
So, David, give us a little bit of an indication as to the most pressing security challenges Africa faced in 2024 and how they have evolved compared to previous years.
Currently, we have countries in the Sahel, about 3 or 4 of them, including Guinea, that are being run by military juntas. Of course, we're not leaving out a country like Chad. So the continent has been rippled by a level of distrust, in the democratic process. Constitutions, are being disregarded. The electoral process, has become a shamble, and people do no longer believe that democracy works for the continent. So this creates a high level of distrust within the continent. That's just one area, Beatrice. But also non-state actors linked to Al Qaeda and ISIS, continue to operate freely within the continent, and that is something which I believe still needs to be addressed. That's a very pressing issue. But lastly, but not the least, I think Africa needs to understand, about new partnerships. Who do they trust, and who is of beneficial, long-term benefit, to their interests. And this is a very key area, because we do not longer have a scenario where it's just one party or the other. There is multilateralism. Right.
All right, gentlemen, on that note, we're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll delve deeper into the stories and shifts that shaped 2024. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue with our discussion. Still with me, Dr. Adere Cavins, David Otto Endele, and Professor Ken Ife. So, David, let's look at some of the positives, because we've talked about the challenges of the security sector. Have there been any gains, for instance, from a post-French exit in West Africa? What sort of positive developments or success stories have there been on the security front that are worth looking back to in 2024?
One thing that we have seen is that a lot of African countries, for example, Nigeria, they are becoming much more independent in the way that they deal with their level of insecurity. They are developing strategies that combine military and civil relations, and this cuts across the entire continent. I mean, we've seen scenarios whereby the level of insecurity that used to bedevil the Lake Chad basin and the Sahel has been reduced. And, these countries have made a deliberate decision to say, we can take care of the insecurity. We can come in with new partners, that understand our capabilities. So African countries are quickly learning the ropes, when it comes to, protecting their internal and external boundaries, so which is a very, very positive thing. I believe that there will be some improvement. But these challenges, still exist, but we're hoping that things will change, for the positive.
So there's been a lot of geopolitical realignments in 2024. Dr. Adere, have there been any notable shifts in China-Africa relations compared to previous years? How has China's role in Africa, for instance, evolved in response to global geopolitical changes in 2024?
Well, I think one of the key things that happened this year was the decision by China to elevate its partnership with all African countries to strategic levels. I think this is a very significant development in terms of China's diplomacy in Africa. It's a demonstration that China treats African countries with the same gloves. There is no idea of big economy or small economy when it comes to partnership with China. So a lot of African countries today feel very comfortable dealing with China because Beijing has simply elevated that relationship to the highest level that it can be, the strategic level. So that is as much as diplomacy is concerned. In terms of trade, of course, this year, again, 283 billion that was set for last year, 340 billion that was set for this year. There are increments in terms of these figures, the trade volumes between the two sides. So you will see more acceptance of African produce into the Chinese market. More African produce is accessing the Chinese market this year than last year. Kenya, for example, added on to the portfolio of its fresh avocados by exporting seafood in China this year. At the same time, we are seeing a shift where China is now trying to ask its companies to set up manufacturing and processing bases in Africa rather than exporting raw materials back to Beijing. And this is simply in appreciation of the fact that producing active economic systems can help Africa to develop, remove young people from the snares of conflict and insecurity, give them gainful employment, and then spur development. It's a strategy by China, which is highly appreciated by Africa under Strategy 2063, that development is the biggest road towards peace and security. And so we see Beijing encouraging its companies to invest in Africa, and more Chinese companies are setting bases in strategic African countries where there is capital, there is human resource, but there are also natural resources.
So, Professor Ife, on that point as well, Dr. Adere has talked about the trade volumes between China and Africa still remaining constant and China remaining Africa's largest trade partner. How has the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, for instance, affected trade dynamics with China?
No, I think China should also look at very seriously at a strategic investment level where they use the special economic zones in Africa to assemble their products and then exploit United States AGOA
which is a way of avoiding the 20% or it may even go up to 100% tariff from China and from America. So use Africa basis for launching back your products into America, and at the same time, engage our natural resources, add value to our natural resources, our mineral resources, and then trade back with it so that we add value. Value addition is so strategic to African economic development that China has to engage with us.
David, you know, there were a number of surprises in African elections in 2024, ranging from Senegal to recently Botswana, Mauritius, South Africa earlier in the year, and youth-led protests in Kenya and Nigeria, really showing that there is a growing participation in governance issues by Africa's youth. How do you see this demographic influencing African elections and governance issues in 2025?
I think there is going to be even more participation by the youth. Africa has the advantage, Beatrice, that more than 75% of its population is made up of young people. And previously, before now, a lot of young people were quite disenfranchised because, of course, you know, they did not see themselves, you know, as being involved in political participation. But with the growth of the social media, with, you know, the information overflow, the death of the print media, you know, whereby the monopoly of the media is no longer in the hands of very particular institutions or the government alone. There is, you know, the exposure of the young people or the young generation of Africans, you know, to understand that, you know, political participation, it's quite crucial. I mean, if they are the majority of the workforce, why not be the majority in terms of participating in electoral processes? And this is, you know, one of the outcomes of the Senegalese, presidential outcome, you know, which, you know, brought a very young candidate, you know, onto the fore. And, you know, I can see that, you know, this is possibly going to spread across the continent. Remember, when we talk about issues of insecurity, Beatrice, within the continent, the majority of the people that are impacted, be it victims as well as perpetrators in particular, they are the young, the younger population are the majority, especially children, you know, under the age of 16 and 17. So that tells you that, you know, the younger generation has a significant role, and that's the backbone of the African economy. That's the backbone of the strength of Africa, this young generation. So I think it's a very significant shift that we're seeing an involvement and engagement, you know, within the younger generation, within the political establishment. So I think it's a very good thing, and I believe that it will drive the economy even much more than predicted by IMF, you know, and the World Bank. I believe that, you know, the more participation of the younger generation, the less the continent, you know, will become bedeviled by insecurity. So the more participatory that we have young Africans, you know, within the political and economic sector, the less, you know, the continent, you know, will become driven by war and insecurity, right, as we're seeing in the case of Sudan.
So, gentlemen, I want to get your winding up remarks of 2024. And let me start off with you, Dr. Adere. What do you think Africa should have focused on but failed to do so in 2024? And did Africa end on a high or on a low?
Many things. As a developing region, Africa needed really to focus on providing opportunities for young people around the continent. And as you mentioned earlier, we saw disaffection of young people with the governance systems in their own countries. I think that it is high time that governments across Africa really consider this demographic, because they are the most talented, they are the most energetic, and they embody the future. And so investing in young people, investing in productive sectors that can give them the right education, the right skills, you know, and the right ecosystem to innovate, I think that would then propel Africa's development agenda forward. The second one, of course, is the idea of pushing towards green development. Africa is, of course, home to the largest renewables, yet remains the most affected also by climate change. And I think the conversation around how to manage the issues of climate change really should be driven by the African agency more than any other person, because we are least involved but most affected. I think the third issue that we really needed to see a lot of urgency around is on working together to strengthen their voices at multilateral levels. There is still a bit of challenge when it comes to collectively pushing forward the African agenda, whether you think about it at global level, multilateral levels like the United Nations. We see the discussion around Africa, how Africa should be part of the UN Security Council, for example. And the unanimity of the African people around this subject is still, not very impressive, although there have been a lot of efforts to galvanize continental position on this matter. So I hope that Africa can continue to speak its voice very strongly, identify key priority areas relevant to its development, and push forward domestic agendas that can create holistic development frameworks.
Professor Ife, you have the final word.
Africa needs to be more prudent and in fact, more transparent and more accountable in public finance management. Because all the challenges we have, whether it is high inflation, or whether it is, all of them boil down to government borrowing and wanting to spend beyond their means. And the effect of it is that fiscal policy dominates monetary policy. So you continue to have inflation, and there's not much investment in not only the capital investment, but also on human resource development. It's good we need education, but education is not all. You need skills, not schools. Schools build skills that have more link to employment and economic growth than simply turning out people who don't find job and designed not to be employed. So I think we need to look a bit more on what we can do to mobilize resources among ourselves and engage private sector, either through PPP mechanisms or empower private sector. Let them drive the economy. Trade is not done by government. It is the private sector that do the trade. All you need to do is to create an enabling environment and engage them in the negotiation that you are doing, so that they don't come back, the whole thing falling flat on their face. We are negotiating rules of origin, we are negotiating that, negotiating trade and services. Where the private sector role in that is state by state, where the private sector in all of this, who will eventually carry out the trade.
Indeed, gentlemen, a very interesting discussion on Africa in 2024. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Dr. Adere Cavins, International Relations Expert, David Otto Endele, Director, Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, and Professor Ken Ife, Finance Analyst and Lead Consultant to the ECOWAS Commission. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X. And you can watch these and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. We leave you now with a look back at some of the defining moments of 2024, events that shaped Africa and captured the world's attention. Thank you for watching, and do join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, Happy New Year.